Hey, I'm back once again to talk about a movie that wasn't so well received and how I would have fixed it. Today, I will be talking about Superman 4: The Quest for Peace. I should quickly preface this video by laying down some ground rules. Since this is a fix video on a movie that exists in a franchise, and a franchise that I have already done fixes for in previous videos, that means that this video will act as a sequel to my fixes for the previous 3 Superman movies and my fix for the Supergirl movie, which might require me to make even more alterations than I would if I was fixing this in a vacuum. Before I get into what elements I would keep and what I would cut, I guess I should talk about the movie itself and how much it works. I don't hate the idea of Superman trying to rid the world of nuclear weapons. I've said before that if you think Superman is too powerful and that's what makes him uninteresting, a diagnosis that I do not agree with, then your solution is to give Superman a problem that he cannot punch, which is what this movie tries to do. And some of the bits here where Clark is really struggling with how much he needs to interfere in human affairs is really solid stuff, and if the other hour and 28 minutes was better, then people would be praising this movie to this day. The biggest problem this movie has is that it really feels like 3 completely separate ideas were crammed into one movie. You've got Clark at the beginning trying to sell his parents' farm, the other good part of this movie, and he says he wants to sell to someone who will actually use it as a farm and not a big developer. And that seems really genuine to who Clark is and how he was raised. That connects later with the subplot of the Daily Planet getting bought out by a father-daughter tycoon team. This movie is very unsubtly saying big business bad, small business good. Weird, since the Daily Planet in every universe is a pretty big business, but whatever. And then you've got Superman trying to get rid of the nuclear weapons, which doesn't actually take up as much of this film's air quotes plot as you might think. In the same way that a lot of people remember Superman 3 as the one where Richard Pryor does some wizardry with some bank accounts, even though that is less than 5 minutes of the movie, this movie is remembered, if it is at all, as, oh yeah, the one with the nuclear bombs. Except that that takes up maybe 10 minutes of an hour-and-a-half long movie. And then we have yet a third subplot, the return of Lex Luthor, who creates a brainless clone of Superman to help him take over the criminal underworld. Oh, Lex, what is wrong with your hair? You look like you're one of the Bean Gesserit sisterhood. Anyway, you'd think that Lex creating a clone would take up more plot space also, but it really doesn't. Now, this one does, air quotes, kinda connect to the nuclear bomb thing, since in the most convoluted way possible, Lex creates Nuclear Man by putting some disgusting protoplasm thing on a nuke that Superman throws into the sun, which activates the clone's creation. But that connection is so minor and weak that if you left the theater to take a leak, you could honestly be forgiven for thinking that Lex just created this clone some other way, like a normal mad scientist would. In a way, this movie's failing is very similar to one of the reasons Superman 3 didn't work. That movie also had a problem with separate subplots taking forever to intersect, except this is even worse because it's 3 subplots and they don't ever connect. I know the budget being slashed in half hurt this movie, and people probably not being all that excited for a follow-up to Superman 3 certainly didn't help, but this feels like they filmed a first draft. Losing your budget should not have affected having a garbage script, and yes, I know that they cut about 40 minutes of footage from this film. Apparently, someone high up thought that they could air the film more times a day if it was shorter. Still, if you lose a third of your movie, you go back to the drawing board. Get your actors to re-record lines. Remove scenes that no longer make sense because the context surrounding that scene has been removed. There really is no excuse for something so shoddy to go to print like this, even with the shoestring budget. And you might be tempted to blame Christopher Reeve, who was responsible for the idea of Superman disarming the world of nukes. But that's only 1/3 of the movie, and Reeve wasn't the only one working on the story. You've also got Lawrence Connor and Mark Rosenthal to spread the blame around. So to make a long story short, too late, this movie sucks. I had never actually seen it before watching in preparation for making this video, and I had heard people say that it was even worse than Superman 3, and I didn't think that that was possible, but yeah, it kinda is. But the point of this video isn't just for me to point out that something is broken. I also have to make an attempt to fix it. Can it be done? Last 2 times I tried this, I pretty much had to throw out the baby with the bathwater. So let's take a look at the individual plot points and see what we can keep, and if we can't, why we can't. In the movie we got, Ernest Hemingway's granddaughter tries to seduce Clark Kent, and over the course of the movie, she starts to genuinely like Clark, and then Nuclear Man, for some reason, takes a liking to her. She's fine, yeah, but I can't tell if he likes her because he's a clone of Superman and maybe Superman likes her, or if he just happens to like the woman who is part of this movie's story out of the billions of people on the planet that he could take a liking to. And then Nuclear Man kidnaps her, at which point she just kind of vanishes from the plot. Like, she's not there at all when Perry White buys back the Daily Planet and fires her dad. But anyway, in my fixed for Superman 3, Lois and Clark are in a committed, more or less stable relationship, so unless we want to turn Hemingway into a willing homewrecker, which I don't want to do, that whole subplot won't be happening here. Likewise, we don't even need Hemingway or her father in this movie, since we already did a thing where Morgan Edge buys the Daily Planet in my fix for Superman 3, and their whole purpose in this movie is to generate some drama in Clark's civilian identity and transform the Daily Planet from a legitimate newspaper into a tabloid. If I was aware of the plot of the Daily Planet getting bought out in this movie being a thing, I had forgotten it when I was doing my fix on Superman 3, so that one is kinda on me. But what's done is done, so that subplot is gone from this movie now. Like I said, I don't hate the idea of Superman trying to get rid of all the nukes in the world, but it is a very heavy idea that deserves a lot more attention and respect than what is given here, and the ending we get in the movie makes absolutely no sense, but I think maybe we can make something work here, though I'll be making quite a few changes to the basic idea. And then we have Lex cloning Superman and creating Nuclear Man, but since my fix for Superman 3 ends with Bizarro, not called that in the movie, escaping while Superman dealt with Brainiac, instead of Lex creating a clone, we will see him lure Bizarro into working with him, and he will control and guide him much like how Brainiac attempted to do in my version of the previous movie. So that's not as bad as what we had to cut from Superman 3 or Supergirl. I'll confess, when I was coming up with my take on Superman 3, I had already had an eye on what I would do for this movie, even though I still hadn't watched it yet. I knew we had an evil Superman clone, so while trying my best to let Superman 3 be its own thing, I wanted to quietly set up this movie. I mentioned in my fix for 3 that it's kind of problematic when you do a sequel that doesn't even feel like a sequel because that's how unconnected it is to the previous movie. The same is kind of true here. I mean, we do have some of the cast members who are missing in 3 returning, but it still doesn't really reference any of the plot stuff from the previous films, which I still think is a problem. When the first 2 movies function as part of one massive saga, then the second 2 movies should also be extensions of said saga for consistency's sake. So with that being said, now that we know what elements we will be keeping, how can we make Superman 4 a watchable movie? So first, I guess I have to follow up on the events of the Supergirl movie, or at least my fix of that movie. I ended my version with Supergirl preparing to come to Earth to meet her cousin for the first time. Well, I know if I was an audience member in the 1980s, I would be pretty disappointed if that wasn't followed up on, but I'm going to ignore that. I know, I'm now ignoring my own plot elements that I set up in earlier fix videos. Let's say that Supergirl met Superman in between movies. It's not ideal, but it's the best I've got for you. In the actual Supergirl movie, there's a blink and you'll miss it line that explains why we don't see Superman. The president confirmed reports that Superman has embarked on a special peacekeeping mission to a galaxy scientists estimate may be several hundred trillion light years from our own. That explanation is incredibly weak, but what if we say that in this movie, Supergirl is on a similar mission? Lois and Clark can be talking about how it's been a few months since Kara left, I wonder how she's doing, that sort of thing. I mean, it's better than not mentioning where Lana Lang is after promoting her to the Daily Planet staff like the Superman 4 that we got. But anyway, on to the actual fixing of this video. Remember that the third movie ends with Brainiac's computer circuits destroyed, and he's unable to access his spaceship that's parked kinda close to Earth. This movie begins with every human government on Earth wanting a piece of Brainiac's technology. I promise I was not thinking of a sequel when I left the ship up there at the end of my fix for Superman 3. This one was just kind of a happy accident. Some countries are even threatening to go to war if they don't get the ship. We'll even see bogus claims that Brainiac attacked our nation during the events of Superman 3 just so that they can lay claim to this wonderful technology for reparations. You might could even have some American general order Superman to bring the ship down to American soil so that it can be analyzed by American scientists, and Superman respectfully declines. I don't know if Superman defined himself as truth, justice, and the American way in my fix for Superman the motion picture, but I'm thinking maybe not. Superman may spend most of his time in America, but he sees himself more as a citizen of the world, not a citizen or agent of one country, which makes this dilemma all the more heartbreaking for Superman. He really isn't sure how much he needs to interfere in the development of his adopted home world. Many world delegates are saying that with Brainiac's technology, they could fix all of the world's problems in days. Shrink ray? No more mountains of garbage polluting the planet. You can just make a landfill take up the size of a basketball. Reverse shrink ray? No more food crisis. The possibilities are limitless. But the problem is, there's also a lot of dangerous weaponry on the ship too, and if this fix for the movie still comes out in 1987, then we're still technically in the Cold War era here, though admittedly not nearly as hostile as it once was. So if Superman flies up there and brings the ship down, he can either hand everything to one nation, possibly endangering everyone else on the planet, or he can somehow evenly divide everything on the ship to all the countries of the world, creating a sort of second arms race with weapons and technology that the people of Earth barely understand. And then you have this American general guy declaring Superman public enemy number 1 because he just gave the Ruskies a device that can create free energy. Either way, Superman doesn't like the outcome, and if he decides to remain neutral in this increasingly hostile debate, he's worried the people of Earth might try to somehow get to the ship without his help. This is something that was kinda touched on in the first Superman movie, not my fix, but the one that we got, with Jor-El's voice telling Superman not to interfere. But that movie was pretty inconsistent on what counted as interference. Turning the planet backwards to save Lois Lane is interference. Okay, sure, I buy that. But using his godlike powers to save her from falling off a building is not? Why is one any different than the other? Superman's been using his powers to help and save people of this planet for 3 movies now, so saying that he's forbidden from interfering doesn't really fly. But maybe it can work here. Up until now, Superman has had out-of-this-world threats, in some cases literally out of this world, things that humanity absolutely could not have dealt with themselves. Heck, even Luthor, an extraordinary Earthling, sure, but an Earthling nonetheless, gave Metropolis trouble for a long time and needed a little Supermanly help in that regard. I know this comic came out over a decade after Superman 4, but I would be kind of pulling some inspiration from the Paul Dini Alex Ross Superman Peace on Earth comic, which has Superman attempting to end world hunger, and it doesn't work out for him. Superman's big emotional arc in this movie is that although he has all of these powers, there's still a lot of stuff that he cannot do anything to fix. Yes, he learned that lesson when his father died, but that was one man dying of natural causes. Superman knows in his brain that he couldn't do anything about that, even if his heart felt something different. But this is something he knows he could do something about. He just isn't sure if he should. So let's cut to Lex Luthor and see what he's up to. If you'll recall, my version of Lex isn't nearly as much of a goofball as Hackman portrayed him as. I played him much closer to Ernst Blofeld, with a full-on criminal empire that he quietly ran for years before Superman showed up. So we'll be continuing with that, but he'll be even angrier because he spent some time in prison, and so now, on top of trying to reclaim his throne, he's also got a personal vendetta against Superman. I like to think Luthor could have escaped prison at any time, but he chose to wait because he could still rearrange pieces of his shattered criminal empire from prison just as easily as he could from his underground base in Metropolis. Over the last couple of movies, we've had Intergang trying to replace Luthor's gang after he went to prison, and while some of Luthor's people went to work for Intergang, many of his underlings scattered to different cities and began taking orders on what to do next to make sure their operations are never compromised like that again. So Luthor's been spending his time in prison, pretending to be helpless and defeated, but really, he's more dangerous than ever because everyone on this planet is now underestimating him. But now Lex sees the global bickering about Brainiac's ship and sees a chance to take his revenge on Superman, and possibly make his domain even more powerful than ever. Lex blows up the entire prison to hide his escape, but Superman is still suspicious. As long as there isn't a body, Lex could be out there causing trouble. One of Luthor's former lackeys, not Otis because he doesn't exist in my version of these movies, and not Lenny, Lex's nephew, because great row, he's even worse than Otis. But some guy, he meets up with Lex because Luthor wanted to hear detailed reports about this clone that fought Superman a couple of months ago. Check out my fix for Superman 3 if you haven't already. Lex knows that even if he had the resources he had before Superman sent him to prison, he still doesn't stand a chance against Superman. He needs a physical weapon to remove Superman, and this clone could be it. Lex sets up thousands of sonic whistles that only Superman can hear all over the world. He knows that Superman is suspicious that he's still alive, but he doesn't care. Superman will investigate a few dozen of these whistles, but will not be able to investigate all of them. Lex doesn't care if he confirms Superman's suspicions that Luthor is alive, because who else would be using these sonic whistles like this? But he really just wants to attract the attention of the rogue clone. If he can get one hit from the clone, he'll be able to track it down and trick it into working with him, and it'll be worth letting Superman know that he's out there somewhere. Lex does find the clone, who, if you'll recall, wasn't even intelligent enough to know human words when we last saw him. Here, he's basically been hiding in the mountains somewhere, leaving everyone alone. He's still very confused about what his role in life is, since he was brainwashed by Brainiac into thinking that Superman was his enemy, but then Superman actually helped him by removing Brainiac's mechanical devices that hurt him. Lex is perturbed at this obstacle, since someone of his intellect should be able to easily convince a mindless thing like this to attack and kill Superman. So Lex plays it a little differently. He says that Superman is his friend, and he needs help helping Superman. It still takes weeks of being nice to Bizarro to get him to trust Lex, but he finally is able to convince him to do what he says to help Superman. Now, during this time, I imagine Lex will be teaching Bizarro so that he is more eloquent than a mindless beast that he was in my fix of Superman 3. He might be like the latter appearances of the MCU version of the Hulk, talking but still very monstrous and growly. No backwards speak or goofball shenanigans like what we usually see with Bizarro, just all of Superman's power with limited speech and intellect. Meanwhile, while Lex is still training Bizarro to be his personal weapon, Lex intends to take advantage of the political atmosphere surrounding Brainiac's ship. There have already been quiet rumors that Kondak or Markovia will resort to launching weapons if their demands are not met soon. Lex plans to amp up the hostilities by providing free super technology to various terrorists and criminal organizations across the globe. While this version of Lex is more the evil crime lord and not so much a mad scientist, he is still a genius, and so whipping up some Flash Gordon tech would be no problem at all. And the more he does this, the more some representative from this country will claim that Superman clearly gave this country access to Brainiac's alien technology. Where else would that laser rifle have come from? We'll have a throwaway line that all of Brainiac's weapons that he gave to Intergang in the previous movie have all been destroyed. So maybe the Metropolis police chief will say, yeah, Superman, where did that laser rifle come from? Of course, Superman knows that Lex is out there somewhere, and while he hasn't heard much from him while he was in prison, Superman cannot think of anyone else capable of stirring the pot like this, and definitely can't think of anyone else who could be behind such advanced technology like this. Now, you might say that Lex should have a vested interest in Earth not being consumed in nuclear war because he lives on the planet too. But remember, Lex has Bizarro. If the King of Markovia is dumb enough to push the button, Lex will send Bizarro to quickly take the nuke and throw it into the sun. In fact, he's counting on this to happen, because once it does, then the King of Markovia will accuse Superman of taking the side of the people of Kahndaq, and this will quickly plunge Superman into yet another rock-and-a-hard-place dilemma. He can't easily deny that he had nothing to do with stopping that nuke from hitting its target, because the cameras caught the nuke clearly changing directions and flying harmlessly into space. They even stopped it and took it frame by frame, and they can see a blue and red blur guiding the missile. Of course, some people of Metropolis saw the clone, but nobody has any reason to suspect that it would do something like this, because it hasn't been seen since Superman fought and defeated Brainiac, so all eyes are on Superman as the guy responsible for this. So instead of some annoying kid from who knows where getting angry that Superman doesn't disarm the world, it's machinations of a super genius that places Superman in this precarious position. And much like the Brainiac ship fiasco, Superman isn't really sure what to do. I have mentioned in a few of these videos that Superman, despite his amazing powers, acts and thinks like a human being, and in times of moral crisis, he goes to the smartest person that he knows for guidance. And so while Superman thinks maybe he should go to the United Nations and suggest a worldwide disarming so that something like the fighting between Kahndaq and Markovia doesn't happen again, Lois thinks that that's a really bad idea. If we assume that the fix for this movie came out with the same release date that it did in the real world, then this would be about half a year after Lois's father was retconned to be a hard-butt US general. I'm gonna guess the script for this movie would have been completed sometime in 1986 before that change was made to Sam Lane in the comics. But maybe we could ideally assume that some sort of cooperative synergy and discussion would happen between Lawrence Connor, Mark Rosenthal, John Byrne, Jerry Ordway, etc. So we could say that Lois grew up a military brat by this point, and even though Lois frequently has disagreements with her father, I would say being raised by him informs quite a bit of who she is as a person. So she would be saying, no, what are you thinking? Lois will rightly point out that much as she loves him, Superman isn't going to be around forever. What happens if Superman dies tomorrow and then someone like Zod or Brainiac marches in? Sure, there's Kara, but she's several hundred trillion light years away right now. Man, that's a lot of light years. If she continues on this trend, she'll be handling the more intergalactic threats while Clark will remain on Earth. So she can't be Earth's guardian forever. Even in the very unlikely scenario that every country in the world would be down with Superman taking away their weapons and throwing them into the sun, humanity still needs a defense against what else might be out there. Or even worst case scenario, what if something like what Brainiac did to Superman happens again, but this time he doesn't pull out of it quite so easily? Superman has devoted his adult life to protecting and saving people, but humanity still needs to be able to protect and save themselves too. Superman realizes that Lois is right, there is no easy solution to this problem. And this is where I disagree with Christopher Reeve's whole motive for doing the nuclear bomb subplot. He wanted to tackle a real world problem despite being advised by Tom Mankiewicz, creative consultant of the first two Superman movies, not to do that. The biggest problem with disarming the world is that if you end the movie with Superman getting rid of all of the nukes, they're still going to be around in the real world. And if you have Superman decide not to disarm the planet, or even worse, start disarming the planet and then stop halfway for no real reason at all, like this movie did, that's almost worse. I do appreciate the movie trying to give Superman a problem that he can't solve by physical force, but I think there are other things this movie could have been about. Yeah, I get it, the 1980s was rough for everyone. You never knew when someone in a big office would decide millions of people don't need to be alive anymore. But like I said earlier, this is a problem that needs a lot more thought put into it than a half-baked, schlocky movie like Superman 4. Also, with me being born after this movie came out, I never did grow up under constant threat of nuclear winter, so my feelings on the importance of getting rid of all of the nukes aren't quite as pronounced as someone who was alive at the time and politically cognizant of what was going on. So while Lois has helped Superman realize that he was being a bit naive, he still has a problem on his hands. The world is ready to light itself on fire, and he needs to put a stop to that. Sure, he can't solve all of the world's problems, but this one is a big one, and Superman feels partly responsible. It was Superman's presence on Earth that attracted Brainiac here in the first place, and it's Brainiac's ship that is prompting these hostilities. While Superman might not be able to realistically take away the nukes, he thinks he can take away their reason for the hostilities, at least in this instance. So Superman goes to Brainiac's ship, thinking that he can find some alien gadget to help him find Luthor. He's optimistic that if he can somehow expose Luthor's part in fanning the flames of war, then maybe he can convince cooler heads to prevail. But as luck would have it, Luthor is already on the ship. I don't know how he got there, maybe this is a little silly, but the movie we got had Ernest Hemingway's granddaughter kidnapped and brought into space and still able to breathe, so I think audiences would be able to forgive Luthor having a spaceship and being able to get to Brainiac's ship parked somewhere in orbit. So anyway, here's where Luthor lays all his cards out. Hoping that the people would turn against Superman when Bizarro framed him for taking sides in an international conflict, that was only part of his big plan. Taking Brainiac's weapons and using them to compound his criminal organization, that was an added plus, but that wasn't Luthor's big endgame. Now that, as far as the world is concerned, Superman is capable and willing of stopping nuclear war, they are all going to be very disappointed when Superman chooses not to stop the next nuke. Realization dawns on Superman's face as he begins to comprehend the horror of Luthor's plan. It doesn't matter how many die or who even dies, but Luthor is willing to kill or allow millions to die just to make Superman look bad. This is kind of similar to the plot we got in the first Superman movie, only in the sense that Luthor is playing with the lives of millions with nuclear weapons. But not to toot my own horn here, this is a little more calculated on Luthor's part. For one, in the first Superman movie, if and when Superman did stop both bombs, that was it for Luthor's plan. But here, Luthor doesn't even have to do anything. Someone will eventually push the button again, and Superman might stop the next bomb or the one after that, but eventually one is going to slip past him. And if the people don't launch the bombs, Luthor is sitting in the best armory a diseased maniac could ever ask for. With his own ingenuity and the super tech Brainiac had lying around, Luthor could probably find a way to launch the bombs remotely, and Superman will still be blamed for not saving the day. And yeah, this is probably a little convoluted, but this is Lex Luthor we're talking about here. He's an actual super genius, so if any supervillain could come up with a convoluted plan and find a way to make it work, I think it would be him. Of course, Superman will try to take Luthor into custody, but he forgot about Bizarro. Luthor tells Bizarro that Superman has been corrupted by Brainiac again, and if Bizarro doesn't stop him, Superman will hurt someone. Bizarro hesitates, but while he does, Luthor pushes a button on the dashboard. Superman rushes out the ship, and Bizarro follows. We'll get a pretty good fight, I suppose. Not really sure if my fix has the budget this movie was intended to have, or the actual budget they ended up with, which would certainly have an impact on a scene like this. But still, I like to think that this would be a pretty good follow-up to the fight scene these two had in my fix for Superman 3. In that movie, it was admittedly basically just there so that we could see a physical fight scene, while the real threat was a more mental one. But here, the stakes are raised. Luthor wasn't messing with Superman when he pushed the button. A nuke was launched, and Superman has to stop it. But poor Bizarro thinks that Superman is a threat and needs to be stopped. The fight goes on for a little bit, mostly Superman trying to get away from Bizarro and being dragged through mountains and stuff while Bizarro chases him. But eventually, Superman, exhausted, will pull a Superman from Batman vs. Superman and finally manage to blurt out that a nuke is about to kill millions. I don't know where, and that's not important. Maybe Hackensack, New Jersey. Anyway, Bizarro starts to realize that he's been manipulated, and as Superman gets up to stop the nuke, Bizarro pushes him to the side and flies away. Even with his limited intellect, he sees that if the nuke lands, it will have been partly Bizarro's fault. So Bizarro grabs the nuke and is carrying it into space where it can harmlessly detonate, like he did earlier, except that in Brainiac's ship, Lex is watching a radar or something and he sees a super fast Kryptonian shape grabbing the nuke. He thinks that it's Superman and he detonates the nuke. I don't know if Superman has ever been nuked before in the comics from around this time, but I'm gonna say he would not survive being up close to a nuclear bomb. Bizarro died saving people. Everyone in the theater cries at his heroic sacrifice. Superman is pretty steamed, but he doesn't go into a berserker rage or anything like that. He takes Luthor back to the World Court, and Luthor gets tried with various crimes against humanity. Can Superman prove anything? Legally he probably doesn't have much of a leg to stand on, but the people trust him and know Luthor to be a criminal, so Lex goes back to jail. Our movie ends with Superman holding a machine from Brainiac's ship, and he pushes a button. The ship begins to shrink down until it's about the size of a Lego in Superman's hand. Superman will store it in his fortress, where it will be much less likely to cause any global problems like it has sitting in space tempting everyone with its alien technology. This shrinking scene would be dependent on the special effects looking kinda good, and that would be dependent on this movie having more than $17,1987 for a budget. Oh, and maybe he has a hologram memorial of Bizarro at the fortress while we're there. So that would be my fix for this movie. I'll admit that it's not perfect. I didn't give Lois nearly enough of a part to play in this story, besides being a counterpoint to Superman wanting to get rid of all the nuclear bombs. And I talk a big talk about how this kind of subject needs its due reverence, and I don't think I quite accomplished that here. Admittedly, the nuclear disarming wasn't what I was most interested in, but I was still trying to find a way to make it work with what I had already done in my fixes for the previous movies. And the best way to do that was to argue in favor of keeping nukes around, because they might be the best way to defend against evil aliens like what we had seen in previous stories. It's definitely not the most highbrow and respectful way to handle this concept, but I don't really like the movie we got pretending its predecessors didn't happen, and it is better than Superman just deciding that he can't finish what he started like he did in a movie that we got. and I admit it's a little light on details. This is not even a first draft, so it's okay to be a little bare, but I do wish I could have fleshed it out a little bit more, maybe added a couple of extra subplots. As is, you can definitely tell where Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 all fall, but it feels like Act 1 is about 10 minutes long. It would need a lot more plotty substance before it could go on to script, but speaking as someone who has never worked on a movie, the most important part of making sure that you have a solid piece is to make sure that you have a solid foundation. There, you can build the walls and stuff like that. So that's it for Superman 4. I'll be tackling another Superman movie in my next What If I Rewrote video, but while you guys wait for that one, be sure to check out my other What If I Rewrotes that I've done already. And if you have any suggestions for something that I could do in the future, I already have some ideas, but if it's something that I have a copy of, and something that I feel passionately enough about to do a video on, I might take your suggestion and run with it. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.